In this final segment on friction in the labor market, we're going to take a look at two other market models, and one would be a monopsony market model and the other a discrimination market model. So first, let's take a look at monopsony as a market concept. We commonly find that people understand the concept of monopoly. Monopoly is the condition where we know that there is one producer of a good and maybe many purchasers of it, but the one producer then has some power in that market that allows them to have some influence over the price, not simply being subject to a equilibrating or market clearing price. A monopsony is really just the opposite. In a monopoly, we're concerned about the firm setting a high price and receiving a high profit, and we know that in fact the firm doesn't set the price, the firm sets the quantity, which then becomes subject to the supply, or rather demand curve for setting the price, but that price may be then high enough that there's super profit, and maybe there's some diminished number of availability of goods so they can get that super profit. That doesn't sound like a good scenario, and in fact it's not. Well, monopsony is really just the opposite. Rather than being one producer of a good in a market, a monopsony would be representative of one buyer of a good in a market. And when we're thinking about monopsony with the labor market, we're thinking about a large purchaser of labor. So this might be a relatively small town in which there are lots and lots of small employers and two or three or maybe just one great big factory that employs most everyone. In which case, they're going to be very influential over the wage, they're going to be very influential over the number of people working, etc. They have a lot of power in this relationship. And we'll see by model in a few moments how they exercise that power. We can think then they are wage setters. They're the ones that are then capable of manipulating the quantity of labor that they'll employ, that'll have a relationship with the wage. And as I said, that's either a very large employer or it might even be a powerful union. The reality is that all firms have some level of monopsony power. And we think that because we observe that there's always some level of unemployed. And so there's always some ability for the firm to have some influence over wages because there's always unemployed people that are willing to take a slightly lesser wage. So all firms have some level of monopsony power. And when we're not in a perfectly equilibrating market, we're not in a market that clears, then all firms will have a little bit of monopsony power. So let's take a look at the monopsony labor market model and understand that in another module later in this course, we'll look at this in great detail. Again, in this friction in the labor market module, we've been looking at a number of items, some of them at a somewhat cursory level, so that we can just use them as an introduction and look at them in detail later on. So think about first the monopoly model. In a monopoly, we have some price and some quantity in a goods market model, and we have some demand, and we have some marginal cost, which we're saying is P star here, but notice that there is no actual supply curve here, because in this case, the one firm that might be the monopoly producer of the good, they supply the number of units they want to supply based upon some other metric that we'll consider here in a moment. And there's no curve that identifies this relationship. It's simply an exogenous decision made because of this other metric perhaps. And so we have this. We then have what's referred to as marginal revenue. And the marginal revenue curve, without getting too detailed about it, is going to follow the rules of marginality that we identified in an earlier module in this course. But this will be for revenue derived by the firm. So this is irrespective, perhaps, of labor itself. This is just the goods market for the good being sold that's produced by this firm. And we know the marginal revenue curve is going to cross the x-axis exactly halfway between 0 and where the demand curve crossed that axis. Now that will be a given for a pure monopoly. And we know that monopoly producers, as all producers, want to produce at a point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Well, that point, of course, is right here. So they will choose to produce at this point, which is going to then dictate this quantity. And if we identify that quantity that the firm will produce, then to identify the price that the public will demand, or the public will pay for it, we then take that quantity intersect it or react it with the demand curve, and it's going to give us some price of monopoly. Well, recognize, of course, that price of monopoly is far greater than P star, which we think of as marginal cost because the marginal cost is going to be equal to the marginal revenue even in an equilibrating market where there are zero profits. So the marginal cost is going to be the same thing as the price, which is the marginal revenue in that market. So there will be a zero profit. Well, in this case, we see that the firm sets the quantity by relationship of this marginal revenue and marginal cost equilibrating decision, which is somewhat of the holy grail, if you will, in microeconomics for the firm, and that then allows the firm to set some greater price than P star or marginal cost, and the difference between marginal cost or P star and this higher price times the number of units they're going to sell is the profit that the firm has. So this is how we think about the monopoly model. Well, the monopsony model works on many of the same principles. Let's think then that we have a labor supply curve, suppliers of labor. We have some marginal expense of labor curve that we've identified here as being higher than or at a greater dollar value than the labor supply at any given quantity of labor. Well, this is interesting. This would suggest that there's some mismatch in this market, and that mismatch is going to be a function of there is one or maybe just a very small number of large employers that are really setting a lot of the pace in this market. In fact, they're identifying how many workers they're going to hire, and then based upon that supply curve for those workers, that's going to then set what the wage is. So in this case, where we didn't see a supply curve in the monopoly model, we don't expressly see a demand curve in the monopsony model, because in this case, the demand is only going to be a function of how many workers the firm chooses to hire, and that's going to be done at the relationship a little bit different than the goods market, but the relationship we've explored before, where the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to marginal expense of labor. So at that equality, we have this point right here, which means we are considerate of a marginal revenue product of labor curve. But recognize I said there's no labor demand expressly because we're not identifying a number of workers based upon the confluence of labor supply and labor demand. We're identifying them based upon a confluence of marginal expense of revenue and marginal revenue product of labor. And the marginal revenue product of labor in this case, since there is this power that the producer has, or rather the buyer of labor, so the producer, the buyer of labor has in this marketplace, we don't know that the marginal revenue product of labor curve and the demand curve for labor in this market are the same. In fact, we're probably pretty confident that they're not the same. We're going to find that the demand curve is not going to be the same here as the marginal revenue product of labor. We've always supposed in the past that it was, but that's been in a perfectly equilibrating market without any friction. And where we have friction in the marketplace, then we know that they are largely not going to be the same. And we'll think about where that might actually come through here in a moment. So in this case, we find that where we might have had some W star and L star had the marginal revenue product of labor curve and been the same as demand, we would then see this equilibration of supply and what might have looked like demand at L star, yielding this W star. We now have this labor in monopsony that is going to be set by the monopsony buyer of these goods at the point where marginal expense of labor equals marginal revenue product of labor. So that's going to set this. It's also going to identify the marginal revenue product of labor being the amount that the firm could actually choose to pay any particular worker. Recall that marginal expense of labor in imperfect markets is greater than the wage. And so just because it has something to do with the wage, it's a marginality. It's not the wage that's actually being paid necessarily. It's the expense of adding one more perhaps. So in this case, we see this quantity relationship develop at L in monopsony. We take and interact that quantity with the labor supply curve, or the producers of labor, and that gives us the wage in monopsony, which you can see is not only lesser than W star, but it's also lesser than marginal revenue product of labor or marginal expense of labor. And those are both consistent with the discussion that we had on marginality as it had to do with wage and marginal expenses in an earlier module. So where might a labor demand curve have existed here. We've said it's not going to exist on marginal revenue product of labor. When we have this friction or inequality, it's not going to be the same curve. But if in fact we find that this is wage for monopoly and wage in monopsony and labor in monopsony, then maybe we're finding that the monopsony producer or the monopsony buyer of labor might have had a labor demand curve that we at least know will come through this particular point. Now, it's arguable as to whether that curve is completely exogenous and vertical, or if that curve actually might come through somewhat like this. It's arguable because depending upon the formatting or functions of that market, it might be either one. This will have something to do with whether there's one employer in the market or maybe just a relatively small number of big employers and lots of little ones. So the labor demand curve is a little bit abstract here in this kind of monopsony market model. Let's look now similarly at a difference between this and discrimination and recognize that, again, we're talking about why different workers receive different wages. And so here we've seen that in a monopsony market where the firm has tremendous buying power, buying influence, that workers in this market will receive a lesser wage, whereas perhaps a worker in a different marketplace with the same skill sets where there isn't this monopsony buying power exerted over them might have a higher wage. So let's think about now another element of this, and that element is discrimination. We know that discrimination in a labor market is where workers with different observable characteristics that have nothing to do with productivity are paid different wages. Perhaps productivity between worker A and worker B are virtually identical, but if worker A is the more commonly hired worker, let's be very politically incorrect, and let's say that they're the white adult male, and if there is then worker B or a female, let's say a African American or a black female, if they have the exact same skill sets, exact same experiences, exact same productivity, we know that in many markets in this country, unfortunately, the white adult male might be paid more. I'm not suggesting that's a good idea. In fact, I would very strongly suggest that it's a terrible idea for a couple of reasons. One of them is subjective and normative, but the other is when we make decisions based upon non-productive characteristics, then we're becoming utility maximizers rather than profit maximizers as we run firms. And in this case, utility comes at the cost of some profit, and you'll see that in just a moment. So in discrimination models or markets, we see that discriminatory employers are utility maximizers. They're seeking to ingratiate themselves. They're seeking to satisfy themselves. They care less about profit than they do about getting beyond personal differences. So they're utility maximizers. Sometimes in these markets, we have to differentiate between outright discrimination and exploitation. Let's assume for a moment that I'm an employer in a market in which there's some discrimination and you are an employer in a market in which there's some discrimination. And in this case, I happen to be the discriminatory employer. And I am one of many discriminatory employers in this particular market. Let's say that we are the norm in this market. It's in perhaps a part of a country that is got some prejudices that are pretty pronounced. And so this discrimination has caused us to push down the wages of the discriminated class. Let's say the discriminated class are migrant workers. And so it's pushed down the wages of them, but you are not a discriminatory employer. You, on the other hand, are a very enlightened employer, and you believe that one should be paid exactly what they are worth, what their productivity is worth, which is exactly what it should be. We find that in a equilibrating labor market, in a clearing labor market without discrimination, then the wage is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. You've seen that in the marginality module within this course. So in this case, I'm a utility maximizer. I'm paying less than marginal revenue product of labor. You are an enlightened employer. You are willing to pay marginal revenue product of labor, but you have to compete in this marketplace with other employers. You have to compete for the cost or price of the goods that you're selling. And so even though you don't necessarily want to be a discriminator, you may well still pay the same wage that I'm paying, simply because we're competing in this market not only for workers but for selling the products that we're manufacturing. And if you pay a higher wage, then you may have to sell your product at a higher price, in which case you may well go out of business. And so your desire to not be discriminatory has caused you to perhaps go out of business. In that case, we would say that you are simply exploiting some of the existing discrimination in the market. You may not be a discriminator in and of yourself, but you're exploiting a discriminatory characteristic. I'm not suggesting that exploitation is necessarily any better or worse than discrimination. I'm just saying that we may be forced to consider a difference between the term. The exploitative firm may be exploiting a existing inequality in the market, but treat all of their employees, regardless of their observable characteristics, treat them all very well, but only pay them the ways that they need to pay them based upon the market around them. So now let's look at a model that would talk about these. There are two different types of discrimination models. There is a wage disparity model and a quantity preference model. The quantity preference model is a little bit less intuitive, so let's start with the wage disparity model, in which you'll see that we have a labor supply curve, we have a labor demand curve, but that labor demand curve is obviously much lower than the marginal revenue product of labor. So in this case, this firm is going to demand this type of worker, and it has a lesser demand for them than their productivity, in which case they're going to pay them a lower W star. This might then be a market for, let's say, males in the workplace, but the marginal revenue product of labor curve would be the market for non-discriminated against males, whereas in this case the labor demand curve might be the curve for the discriminated males. So this might be a Hispanic male, an immigrant perhaps, that maybe they do or don't speak English based upon how long they've been working in this country and how aggressive they are in terms of learning languages. So there's a labor demand curve that is less than the productivity, in which case we see the wage is less than the marginal revenue product of labor. In fact, the marginal revenue product of labor is going to be equal to the wage plus some discrimination amount. And again, this would be motivated by some utility maximizing firms rather than profit maximizing firms. These are ones giving up some profitability because they want to end up with with some satisfaction. And we see that they're giving up some profitability because were they not, we could have been out here having L prime number of workers instead. And so we're having more production, and assuming that the goods market is competitive, the price of the output good is going to be constant between each of the firms. And so if we have a greater number of units produced, we're going to have a greater number of revenues, and we're going to then come towards profit maximization. Whereas we've curtailed the number of workers, which also means we're curtailing the number of units of output, and so we're curtailing our profitability in exchange for some utility maximization. We see this slightly differently in the quantity preference model, where there now is no pretense of labor supply. There now is simply a marginal revenue product of labor curve, and we then have recognition that were there a supply and demand relationship, there might have been a W star and an L star at this point on the marginal revenue product of labor curve, but rather than hire L star number of workers, this firm has decided to hire LD number of workers because the number of workers it's hiring, or the workers that it's hiring, are in the discriminated class, so it hires fewer of them. It's not that this firm won't hire them, it is that this firm hires fewer of them than they might have otherwise have hired, but they pay them W star because that's all they need to pay them. And they get this benefit or this premium in their marginal revenue product of labor, as we have this relationship with that being equal to W star plus D. So they get this premium, but it's a premium on a smaller number of workers, which means it is then a lesser output. And we actually would see, when we look at this model in detail later on in the course, we'll see that they actually have a lesser profitability.